When your neighbors call you crazy, you listen. But when the sky turns black and the ambient air reaches 300 degrees, being crazy is the only thing that keeps you breathing. 62-year-old Sarah Jenkins dug a grave in her basement, or so everyone thought, until the mountain caught fire. Blackwood Ridge was the kind of Northern California enclave where wealthy retirees and nature enthusiasts went to disappear into the pines. It was beautiful, serene, and entirely isolated. It was also a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Sarah Jenkins knew this better than anyone. At 62, she was a quiet woman with calloused hands and a spine like tempered steel. 5 years ago, she had buried her husband, David, after a brutal 6-month battle with pancreatic cancer. David had been a structural engineer and a man deeply respectful of the untamed wilderness surrounding their cedar-wrapped home. Before he got sick, he had started a project in the deep corner of their fieldstone basement. He called it a root cellar expansion. Sarah knew it was something else entirely. It was an insurance policy against the dense, drought-stricken forest that loomed over their property. When David died, the house grew painfully silent. To drown out the deafening roar of her grief, Sarah picked up his shovel. At first, it was just an hour a day. Then, it became an obsession. The town of Blackwood Ridge quickly caught wind of the widow's strange behavior. Her immediate neighbor, Thomas O'Connor, a retired investment banker from San Francisco, who drove a pristine silver Porsche Cayenne and treated the mountain like a manicured resort, was the first to complain. "Sarah, for God's sake, the noise is unbearable." Thomas had sneered over their shared property line one brisk October morning, eyeing the massive mounds of displaced red clay tarped off in her backyard. "You're running a diesel generator at all hours. You're ruining the property values. What are you even doing down there? Digging to China?" "Just finishing what David started, Thomas," Sarah had replied mildly, wiping sweat from her brow, her graying hair pulled back into a messy bun. She didn't tell him about the steel beams. She didn't tell him about the reinforced concrete pillars or the corrugated iron roof she was painstakingly assembling underground. She certainly didn't mention Gregory Miller, an old friend and independent contractor who had been quietly dropping off truckloads of timber, industrial ventilation pipes, and heavy-duty battery banks in the dead of night. Gregory was the only one who knew the true scale of the project, and he was sworn to secrecy. Over 3 grueling years, Sarah Jenkins carved out a subterranean masterpiece. She dug a tunnel that plunged 20 feet below the topsoil, extending 450 feet past the tree line, beneath the rocky ridge, and terminating in a naturally reinforced, abandoned mining culvert near the edge of Miller's Creek. It was 3 feet wide and 5 feet high. She had to stoop to walk through it, but it was structurally sound, rigged with low-voltage LED strip lights, and stocked with emergency rations, oxygen canisters, and fire blankets. The locals mocked her at the diner down in the valley. They called it the widow's tomb. They whispered that grief had fractured her mind. Sarah ignored them. She remembered the catastrophic fires of 2018, the way the wind had carried embers the size of golf balls, the way people had burned alive in their cars, trying to escape down single-lane mountain roads. She knew the geography of Blackwood Ridge. There was only one paved road in and one road out, a twisting, perilous descent through a canyon heavily choked with deadwood. If a fire ever started at the base of the canyon during a windstorm, Blackwood Ridge would become an inescapable furnace. And then, on a blistering Tuesday in late August, the Diablo winds began to howl. The morning was unsettlingly warm. By noon, the humidity had plummeted into the single digits, and the wind was tearing through the pines at 60 miles per hour. It sounded like a phantom freight train rushing through the canopy. Inside her home, Sarah was packing away some summer clothes when the lights flickered and died. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the violent rattling of her window panes. She walked out onto her back deck. The air was thick, suffocating, and carried the undeniable, acrid scent of burning pine pitch. Sarah looked to the southwest. Above the tree line, the sky wasn't blue. It was a bruised, sickly purple, quickly fading into an apocalyptic shade of orange. A massive plume of smoke was aggressively boiling into the stratosphere, blocking out the sun. The shadow it cast over the ridge was terrifyingly unnatural. Her cell phone buzzed violently on the patio table. It was an emergency alert, the shrill tone cutting through the wind. "Mandatory evacuation. Wildfire imminent. Do not wait. Leave immediately. Sarah didn't panic. She had spent 5 years preparing for this exact moment. She walked inside, grabbed her pre-packed emergency go bag, and locked her front door. But as she moved toward the basement stairs, she heard the frantic, blaring horns echoing from the main road. The panic outside was absolute. Down on Ridge Road, the only artery connecting the mountain community to the valley below, absolute chaos had descended. Sarah jogged to the edge of her property, peering through the tree line to see the road. It was a parking lot. Dozens of vehicles, trucks, sedans, luxury SUVs were bumper to bumper, completely gridlocked. The wind shrieked, bending 100-foot pines to terrifying angles. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they weren't getting closer. They were stationary, likely blocked by the same mass of fleeing residents. Through the dust and swirling ash, Sarah spotted Thomas O'Connor. He was leaning on the horn of his silver Porsche, screaming at a rusted pickup truck in front of him. A family towing a horse trailer had jackknifed across the narrow lane a quarter-mile down, effectively trapping everyone behind them. The evacuation route had failed exactly as Sarah had feared. They were completely boxed in. Suddenly, the ambient temperature spiked. It felt like an oven door had been kicked open. Sarah looked up. The crest of the canyon, not 2 miles away, was suddenly crowned in a wall of furious, churning orange. The fire wasn't just burning. It was devouring the landscape, pushed by the gale, force winds. It was crowning, jumping from treetop to treetop in massive, explosive leaps, moving faster than a man could sprint. Sarah pulled her phone out. She had 1 bar of signal left. She dialed her daughter Emily, who lived in Seattle. "Mom? Mom! I'm watching the news. The fire is in your county. Are you out? Tell me you're out." Emily's voice was cracked with terror. "Emily, listen to me carefully," Sarah said, her voice eerily calm despite the ash beginning to fall like dirty snow around her. "I am not on the road. The road is blocked." "What? Mom, you have to run. You have to." "Emily, stop. Breathe." Sarah watched a glowing ember the size of a fist land on her dry lawn. It ignited instantly. She stamped it out with her boot. "I am going into the cellar, into the tunnel. Do you understand? I am doing exactly what David and I planned." "Mom, please." Emily sobbed. "I love you, sweetie. I am safe. I will call you when I see the sky again." Sarah hung up as the cell towers finally failed. The sky directly overhead turned pitch black, illuminated only by the terrifying strobe-like flashes of exploding transformers down the street. The roar of the fire was deafening now, drowning out the car horns. She turned to head back to her house, but a movement caught her eye. Thomas O'Connor had abandoned his Porsche. He was running back up the hill toward his property, his face pale, his eyes wide with a primal, unadulterated horror. He tripped over a tree root, tearing the knees of his expensive trousers, and scrambled up, leaving his luggage behind in the dirt. The fire breached the lower edge of the neighborhood. The heat was suddenly blinding. 2 houses down, a wooden deck spontaneously combusted from the sheer radiant heat, bursting into flames before the actual fire even touched it. "Thomas!" Sarah screamed over the roar of the wind. He didn't hear her. He was running toward his massive 3-story cedar home. It was a death trap. With its oversized windows and wooden frame, it would burn to the foundation in minutes. Sarah didn't think. She sprinted across the property line, tackling Thomas just as he reached for his front door. "Get off me. I have to get my safe. I have to get my papers," Thomas shrieked, flailing wildly. He was completely out of his mind with panic. "Your house is going to explode, you idiot," Sarah roared, gripping his collar with strength she didn't know she had. "Look at the trees." Thomas looked back. The towering pines behind his property were violently shedding burning needles, raining fire down upon his roof. As they watched, the heat shattered the massive bay window of his living room with a sound like a bomb detonating. Glass sprayed across the porch. "We're going to die," Thomas whimpered, his legs giving out. "The road is blocked. We're going to burn." "Not today," Sarah said, hauling him to his feet. "Run to my house. Now." She dragged the weeping man across the lawn. The air was burning her lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. The smoke was so thick, They could barely see 10 feet in front of them. The grass beneath their boots was crisping and blackening. They reached Sarah's back door just as the trees bordering her front yard erupted in a wall of flame. She shoved Thomas inside and slammed the heavy door, locking it. The interior of the house was already sweltering, the air hazy with smoke that was seeping through the weather stripping. "Downstairs," Sarah commanded, shoving a flashlight into Thomas's trembling hands. "The basement?" Thomas coughed violently, wiping soot from his eyes. "We'll be roasted alive down there. It'll be an oven." "Shut up and walk, Thomas." Sarah practically threw him down the wooden steps. She reached the bottom, moving past her laundry machines and the storage racks, heading for the heavy steel door in the far corner, the door she had installed 3 years ago. The door Thomas had mocked. Above them, the house groaned. A terrifying, heavy thump shook the ceiling boards. A burning branch had landed on her roof. Sarah spun the locking wheel on the steel door. It clicked open. She pulled it back, revealing the dark, cool, earth-scented mouth of the tunnel. Low-voltage lights flickered to life, illuminating the reinforced timber framing descending into the earth. Thomas stared at the tunnel, then back at the widow he had called crazy for years. "Get in," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, deadly serious register. As Thomas stumbled into the tunnel, the basement windows above them shattered simultaneously, blowing a wave of blistering fire and superheated black smoke into the room. Sarah yanked the heavy steel door shut, pulling the interior locking bar down just as the inferno swallowed her home. The roar of the fire vanished, replaced by the dead, terrifying silence of the underground. The heavy steel door sealed shut with a metallic clang that reverberated down the narrow corridor like a gunshot. For a fraction of a second, there was absolute, suffocating darkness. Then, a sharp click echoed from a breaker box, and a string of low-voltage, amber LED lights hummed to life along the ceiling. Silence. After the deafening, monstrous roar of the firestorm above, the quiet of the subterranean world was profound, almost physical. It hit Thomas O'Connor like a physical blow. The wealthy investment banker slid down the corrugated metal wall, his expensive Italian loafers scuffing against the damp, packed clay floor. He buried his soot-stained face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with violent, uncontrollable sobs. He had just watched his multi-million-dollar estate, his vintage car collection, and his entire curated life vaporize in a storm of embers. Sarah Jenkins didn't cry. She stood by the steel door, her hand resting flat against the cool metal. Through 5 inches of reinforced steel and high-density concrete, she could feel a faint, terrifying vibration. It was the physical shockwave of her own home, the house she and David had built, the living room where they had raised Emily, the bedroom where David had taken his last breath collapsing into a pile of white-hot ash. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a single, ragged breath of mourning, and then locked her emotions in a mental vault. Survival first, grief later. "Get up, Thomas," Sarah said. Her voice was flat, devoid of sympathy. The air in the entryway was already growing stale. "We can't stay here. The fire is going to burn directly over us, and the radiant heat will eventually bake the upper soil. We need to move deeper." Thomas looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide with residual panic. He stared down the length of the tunnel. It stretched out before them, a 3-foot-wide, 5-foot-high tube of heavy timber bracing, corrugated iron, and exposed red earth. It looked like an endless, claustrophobic birth canal leading straight into the abyss. "How?" Thomas choked out, coughing up black phlegm. "How long is this thing? Where does it go?" 450 feet. It drops at a 10-degree grade to slip under the bedrock of the ridge, then connects to the old copper mining culvert near Miller's Creek, Sarah explained, reaching to a pegboard on the wall and grabbing 2 heavy-duty respirators and a high-lumen tactical flashlight. She tossed a mask into Thomas's lap. "Put that on. The ventilation system is running on a closed-loop battery bank, drawing air from the creekside. But if the fire jumps the water, we might get smoke blowback. Let's go." Thomas fumbled with the straps of the mask, his hands shaking violently. "I called you crazy," he whispered, the realization washing over him. "I threatened to sue you with the Homeowners Association. I tried to get the county to issue a stop work order." "I know," Sarah said, turning her back to him and crouching slightly to accommodate the low ceiling. "If you had succeeded, we'd both be carbon right now. Keep your head down and stay close to me." They began the trek. The descent was grueling. The air grew significantly cooler the deeper they went, carrying the heavy metallic scent of damp soil and ancient rock. Every 50 feet, Sarah checked a battery-powered environmental meter mounted to the timber frames. Oxygen levels were stable at 20%. Carbon monoxide was 0. David's engineering was holding. But the earth above them was not at peace. As they reached the 200-foot mark, a terrifying sound groaned through the ground. It wasn't the roar of the fire. It was a deep, guttural, structural shifting. Thum. Dust and loose dirt rained down from the corrugated iron panels above their heads. Thomas shrieked and dropped to his knees, covering his head. What was that? What was that? Trees falling, Sarah said tightly, shining her flashlight upward. 100-foot pines are coming down. The fire is burning through their root system. Is the ceiling going to hold? It's braced with steel every 10 feet. It should. She said should, not will. They pushed forward, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing echoing inside their respirators, and the crunch of their boots on the dirt. As they approached the 300-foot mark, the temperature suddenly spiked. It wasn't a gradual warmth. It was a wall of oppressive, stifling heat that slammed into them. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. The environmental meter on the wall here was flashing red. What's wrong? Thomas asked, bumping into her back. Sarah didn't answer. She pointed her flashlight down the tunnel. 50 feet ahead, the neat, orderly line of timber and steel was gone. The tunnel had violently twisted. A massive, jagged fissure had torn through the left wall, and the heavy steel support beams were bowed inward like wet noodles. But that wasn't the worst part. Glowing through the cracks in the collapsed clay was a horrifying, pulsating orange light. Oh my God, Thomas whimpered, staggering backward. The fire. It's underground. It's a root fire, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. Above them stood the Goliath pine, a 200-year-old behemoth that was the pride of Blackwood Ridge. The fire on the surface had been so intense that it hadn't just burned the tree. It had chased the resin-rich root system straight down into the earth. The massive taproot, thicker than a man's torso, had burned like a subterranean fuse, turning the soil around it into a kiln. The intense heat had dried the clay surrounding the tunnel until it fractured, causing a localized collapse. A pile of smoldering earth and burning, charcoal-like roots completely blocked their path. The tunnel was choked, and worse, the primary air intake pipe running along the ceiling had been sheared in half by the collapse. A high-pitched alarm began to blare from the ventilation unit. Warning. Oxygen. Depletion. Warning. We have to go back, Thomas screamed, spinning around. To what? Thomas? Sarah barked, grabbing his shoulder and spinning him back. The house is gone. The steel door is likely welded shut by the heat by now. There is no going back. Smoke was beginning to visibly pool at the ceiling of the tunnel, creeping toward them. The ambient temperature was rising rapidly, turning the enclosed space into a pressure cooker. Sweat poured down Sarah's face, stinging her eyes beneath the mask. She moved to a small emergency lockbox, mounted on the wall near the collapse zone. She keyed in a code, pulled the metal door open, and retrieved a military-grade entrenching tool, a small folding shovel. She also pulled out 2 heavy leather welder's gloves. We dig, Sarah commanded, tossing him the gloves. Are you insane? It's on fire, Thomas yelled, pointing at the glowing embers embedded in the collapsed dirt. We only need to clear a gap wide enough to crawl through. Sarah snapped, unfolding the shovel and locking the blade into place. Put the gloves on, Thomas. If we stay here, we suffocate in 10 minutes. Sarah attacked the pile. She drove the shovel into the hot earth, hauling away heaps of smoking clay and kicking it behind her. The heat radiating off the pile was blistering. Within minutes, her arms felt like lead. The smoke was thickening, obscuring the LED lights, turning the tunnel into a hazy, toxic nightmare. She hacked at a glowing, burning tree root, trying to lever it out of the way. "Help me," she wheezed, her lungs burning despite the respirator. Thomas stood frozen, trembling, staring at the ruins. He looked at his hands that had never known manual labor, hands that managed portfolios and typed on glass screens. He looked at the 62-year-old widow, who was fighting like a cornered wolverine to save both of their lives. A sudden, sharp memory pierced Thomas's panic. He remembered sitting on his pristine deck, sipping a scotch, laughing with his golf buddies about the crazy widow digging a hole in the dirt. The shame that washed over him was hotter than the fire. "Give it to me," Thomas said. His voice was suddenly steady. Sarah looked back, surprised. Her face was flushed, dark red, and she was visibly trembling from exertion. "Give me the shovel, Sarah. You need to rest," Thomas said, stepping forward. He pulled the heavy leather gloves over his manicured hands. Sarah handed him the tool and slumped against the cool side of the tunnel, gasping for breath. Thomas approached the barricade. He didn't just dig. He attacked the earth with a frantic, primal desperation. He jammed the shovel into the burning soil, heedless of the embers that showered over his expensive trousers, singeing the fabric. When the shovel wasn't fast enough, he dropped it and used his gloved hands, tearing chunks of scalding hot clay and throwing them aside. A massive, glowing root blocked the top of the pile. Thomas grabbed it. The heat seared through the thick leather instantly, blistering the palms of his hands. He screamed in agony, but he didn't let go. He planted his boots, roared, and yanked backwards. With a sickening snap, the burnt root broke free, collapsing a section of the dirt and revealing a pitch-black opening. A rush of cool, fresh air blew through the gap from the creek side of the tunnel. "I got it!" Thomas gasped, falling onto his back, cradling his burnt hands against his chest. "I'm through. Go!" Sarah yelled over the wailing oxygen alarm. Thomas squeezed into the 2-foot gap, shimmying over the blistering earth on his belly. He scraped his back against the twisted steel of the ceiling, tearing his shirt, but he pushed through, tumbling down the other side into the clear section of the tunnel. Sarah followed. The space was terrifyingly tight. As she dragged herself through, a secondary shift occurred in the earth above. A heavy clump of dirt fell, pinning her right leg. "Thomas!" she cried out. Two hands materialized from the darkness. Thomas grabbed her by the collar of her shirt and hauled backward with all his remaining strength, dragging her free just as the gap collapsed completely behind her, sealing off the burning section. They lay on the cold earth, gasping in the sweet, unfiltered air coming from the creek. They had survived the bottleneck. The final 150 feet of the tunnel was a silent, agonizing march. Thomas's hands were badly burned, wrapped clumsily in a sterile gauze Sarah had pulled from her medical kit. Sarah was limping, her knee bruised and swelling from the collapse. Neither spoke. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. The low-voltage lights abruptly ended. Ahead of them, at the very end of the tunnel, was a heavy, circular iron bulkhead. It was an original fixture from the 1920s copper mining operation, heavily retrofitted by David with watertight seals and a massive locking wheel. They had reached the end. Sarah limped forward and grabbed the wheel. She threw her weight into it. It didn't budge. "No," she whispered. She tried again, straining until her knuckles turned white. "No, no, no." "What's wrong?" Thomas asked, stepping up behind her. "It's jammed, or there's debris piled against it on the outside." Sarah pounded her fist against the iron. "It opens outward, into the creek ravine. If a tree fell against it," panic, cold and sharp, threatened to finally break Sarah's composure. To come this far, to survive the inferno and the collapse, only to die locked in a steel tube inches from salvation. David wouldn't have left a single point of failure, Sarah muttered to herself, scanning the darkness frantically with her flashlight. "Think, Sarah, think." She shone the light to the left of the door. Bolted to the timber frame was a bright, red, heavy-duty hydraulic jack. Attached to it was a thick steel rod, positioned directly against the center of the bulkhead door. Written on a piece of masking tape in David's neat architectural handwriting were the words, "In case of obstruction." A tear finally escaped Sarah's eye, cutting a clean line through the soot on her cheek. Even from the grave, her husband was protecting her. "Thomas, I need you to pump this handle," Sarah said, pointing to the jack. "Your hands are burnt, but you have to use your forearms. Lean your weight on it." Thomas didn't hesitate. He wedged his elbows over the steel handle of the hydraulic pump and threw his body weight downward. The jack clicked. He pumped it again, and again. Creak. The iron bulkhead groaned. Thomas kept pumping, his teeth gritted in pain. The hydraulic piston extended, applying thousands of pounds of pressure against the door. With an ear-splitting shriek of grinding metal, The hinges gave way, and the heavy iron door burst open, shoving aside a massive pile of scorched earth and dead branches that had blocked the exit. Blinding, hazy daylight poured into the tunnel. They stumbled out of the culvert and fell to their knees in the soft, muddy bank of Miller's Creek. The water was shallow but blessedly cool. Sarah plunged her face into the stream, washing away the toxic ash and sweat, drinking greedily. Thomas collapsed beside her, immersing his bandaged hands in the water, letting out a long, shuddering breath of relief. When they finally looked up, the sight stole whatever breath they had left. The world they knew was gone. Blackwood Ridge was a smoldering, apocalyptic wasteland. The towering green pines had been reduced to blackened, smoking toothpicks pointing toward a bruised, smoke-choked sky. Where massive, multi-million-dollar estates had stood just an hour ago, there was nothing but glowing white foundations and the twisted, melted frames of luxury cars. The silence was absolute, save for the crackle of distant, dying fires. They sat by the creek for 14 hours. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, but the residual heat from the scorched earth kept them warm. Sarah shared an emergency ration bar and a canteen of clean water with Thomas. They watched the stars struggle to pierce the heavy canopy of smoke. "You saved my life," Thomas said softly into the darkness. "I mocked you. I belittled you. And you saved me." "David saved us," Sarah corrected gently, looking back at the dark mouth of the culvert. "I just dug the hole." At dawn, the familiar rhythmic thumping of rotor blades broke the silence. A bright yellow search and rescue helicopter crested the ridge, its searchlight sweeping over the devastated landscape. It hovered over the creek, the downdraft kicking up a storm of gray ash. A rescue basket was lowered. Paramedic Sullivan, a burly man in fire-retardant gear, hit the mud and rushed toward them, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We got 2 survivors!" Sullivan screamed into his radio, staring at them as if they were ghosts. "Sector 4. How the hell did you 2 survive the firestorm?" The whole canyon flashed over. Nothing made it out. Thomas stood slowly, his clothes in rags, his hands bandaged, soot covering his face. He looked at Paramedic Sullivan, and then he looked down at Sarah Jenkins, the widow of Blackwood Ridge. "We took the scenic route," Thomas said. "Sarah's unbelievable survival proves that preparation isn't paranoia, it's a lifeline. When disaster strikes, the crazy ones are often the only ones left standing." If this harrowing escape story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible real-life survival stories.